My name's Lena Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and I own a small electronics repair shop in Portland called Circuit Haven. But long before this quiet little shop became my world, I was the forgotten child of the Whitmore family, the one who was never supposed to make anything of herself. And if I told you that my parents secretly gave my inheritance to my brother behind my back, would you believe me? Probably not. That's what makes this story worth hearing. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. And if you enjoy stories like this one, about real family drama, betrayal, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you more stories that hit close to home. When I was a little girl growing up in Austin, Texas, the Whitmore house looked picture perfect from the outside. White siding, green lawn, and the faint smell of lemon cleaner that my mom swore kept away bad energy. Inside, though, everything was about Adam, my older brother, my parents' golden ticket. He was born with that kind of confidence that made people listen, that made teachers beam and neighbors say things like, "That boy's going places." Dad used to pat Adam's back after every soccer game, every good grade, every half-decent speech. "That's my boy," he'd say, "a leader." Then his eyes would drift to me, quiet in the corner, notebook in hand, hair half-tied and full of questions. "And there's Lena," he'd add, his tone soft but dismissive, always tinkering. I don't think he ever meant it to sting, but it did. It landed like a small stone every time. Nothing fatal, just enough to bruise. I wasn't loud. I wasn't graceful. I didn't dream of pageants or cheerleading. I dreamed of machines that could think, of circuits and gears that hummed back when you whispered to them. I built my first motorized toy from an old radio when I was 9. My parents didn't praise it. They warned me not to mess with electricity. Adam, meanwhile, once painted a stick figure of our dog, and it got framed above the fireplace. At 10, I learned the quietest truth about my family. The volume of your worth depended on how loud your applause was, and I was never loud enough. The only person who seemed to see through all of that was my grandmother, June Whitmore. She was an electrical engineer back in the 70s, one of the first women in her company. Every Saturday, she'd pick me up in her rust-colored truck and drive to her little workshop on the edge of town. It smelled like coffee grounds and soldering iron. "Some people talk their way into rooms," she used to say, handing me a wrench. "But you, Lena, you'll build your own door." At the time, I thought it was just something wise old women said. I didn't realize it would one day become the line that saved me. When I was 13, my brother won a statewide business competition. He designed an app that did nothing more than play random inspirational quotes. My parents threw him a party with balloons that said "Future CEO." I remember standing there, invisible in a corner, holding a plate of cake I didn't want. My grandmother leaned down and whispered, "Not every victory gets applause, honey. Some just take longer to bloom." She passed away a few years later. The funeral was all polished tears and polite speeches. My father spoke about family values and legacy. I didn't speak at all. I just stared at the casket and thought about all the unfinished projects sitting in her garage, the ones she'd promised we'd finish together. After she died, I felt like the only person who had ever understood me was gone. My parents were too busy shaping Adam into the family's masterpiece to notice I was drifting. I stopped trying to impress them and started building things for myself. A solar charger made from junkyard panels, a homemade drone that barely flew. They called it a distraction. At family dinners, they talked about Adam's internships, his leadership seminars, his future MBA. My future, apparently, didn't fit into conversation. The funny thing about being overlooked for so long is that you learn to find comfort in the shadows. You start building quietly, planning silently, waiting for the moment you can step into the light on your own terms. That's what my 20s became, a long preparation for a day that I didn't even realize was coming. Sometimes people think neglect comes only in the form of yelling or punishment. But in my house, neglect came wrapped in politeness and silence. It was the smile that said, "We love you, but not like that." The pat on the head that meant, "You're fine as long as you stay small." I stayed small, for years. But something was shifting in me, quietly, like a current beneath calm water. Every time Adam got another award, another "so proud of you" post on Facebook, that current grew stronger. Every time my father said, "You should be more like your brother," it grew sharper. Still, I waited, because Grandma June had told me patience wasn't weakness, it was a blueprint. And then, one ordinary evening, when I was 24, I was going through her old notebooks. Between sketches of circuits and power grids, I found a note addressed to me. Her handwriting was shaky but sure. Open quote, "If they never hand you the key, darling, build your own lock and make them ask you how it works." Close quote. That line became a secret promise to myself. I didn't know then that the key she was talking about wasn't just metaphorical. She had left me something, a small trust fund, a quiet piece of faith that would become both my salvation and the trigger for the biggest betrayal of my life. But that comes later. For now, picture this. A young woman sitting alone in a dim garage, hands stained with solder, fixing a broken transistor radio that belonged to the only person who ever saw her potential. Outside, her family is celebrating her brother's latest success. Inside, she's learning how to build a future from scraps. Because sometimes, the ones who are ignored the longest are the ones quietly preparing to rebuild everything. Before I tell you what happened next, how that small act of belief turned into a storm that would change my life forever, I want to ask you something. If you were in Lena's place, constantly overshadowed by a golden sibling, what would you do? A. Fight for recognition and demand fairness. B. Stay quiet and build your own path in silence. Comment your answer below. I really want to know what kind of person you are. Grandma June passed away in the middle of a soft Texas spring, the kind where the air smells like rain and dust and something sweet you can't quite name. I was 21, old enough to understand death, but not old enough to know what absence really meant. My parents handled everything, the funeral, the estate, the polite condolences that came in casseroles and sympathy cards. I stayed mostly silent, helping where I could, standing in the background like I always did. A week after the service, I went to her house one last time. The workshop was exactly how we'd left it. Half-finished circuit boards, a jar of mismatched screws, a cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Engineer." The air was still thick with the smell of copper and coffee. That scent would stay with me for years like a ghost. It was there, sitting on her old work stool, that I realized how much of her had quietly shaped me. June never lectured. She guided by example. Hands steady, voice calm, teaching me that creation didn't have to be loud to be powerful. She used to say, "People think brilliance shouts, but most of the time it whispers." At the time, I thought she meant machines. Later, I understood she meant people. When the lawyer called a month later, I didn't expect much. I figured Grandma's house and savings would go to my parents. They had always managed the family's finances. I didn't even know she had a lawyer. The meeting took place in a small office in downtown Austin. I remember the blinds were half closed, the kind of dim lighting that makes everything feel like a secret. The man across the desk introduced himself as Mr. Blakely, executor of her estate. He smiled when he saw me. "Your grandmother spoke highly of you, Miss Whitmore. She wanted you to have this." He slid a brown envelope across the table. Inside were a few documents, a letter, and a bank statement showing a trust in my name, valued just under $100,000. I stared at it, confused. "This must be a mistake," I said. "My grandmother didn't have that kind of money." "She set it aside slowly, over many years," he said. "She told me it wasn't meant to make you rich, but to help you start something of your own when the time was right." I remember sitting there, heart racing, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. For once, someone in my family believed I was capable of starting something. Grandma June hadn't just left me an inheritance, she'd left me faith. When I told my parents that evening, their reactions were muted but sharp in their own way. Mom's voice went tight with politeness. "Oh, that's sweet. Your grandmother always had her little projects." Dad cleared his throat, glancing at the papers. "It's a decent sum, but let's not get carried away. We'll make sure it's managed properly." I didn't understand at first what he meant by managed properly. He spoke in the tone he used when talking about house budgets or Adam's tuition, final, unquestionable. The trust, according to the letter, would remain under parental supervision until I turned 25. I nodded, too naive to question it. I didn't realize that in giving them control, I was unknowingly handing them the power to rewrite my future. Over the next few years, the trust became something almost mythical to me. I thought about it whenever I fixed a neighbor's computer or took extra shifts at the repair shop where I worked. I imagined the day I'd finally access it and turn my ideas into something real. A business, maybe, or a small tech studio. The thought became a quiet motivation, like a light at the end of a very long tunnel. Meanwhile, life in the Whitmore household carried on as usual. Adam graduated with honors, landed a shiny internship in Dallas, and posted about it like he just solved climate change. My parents threw a barbecue in his honor. When relatives asked about me, Mom would smile tightly and say, "Lena's still figuring things out." I'd nod and laugh, pretending it didn't sting. But behind closed doors, I worked. I took community college classes in electrical engineering and spent nights building prototypes. Tiny solar-powered lamps, a low-cost battery charger, things no one would ever see but me. The garage of my rental apartment became my world. Whenever exhaustion hit, I'd pull out Grandma June's letter and read it again. Her words had become my kind of scripture. Build with patience, trust in quiet progress. At 23, I visited her grave for the first time since the funeral. I brought one of the lamps I'd made, a small crooked thing that glowed a soft amber when the sun hit it right. I placed it beside her headstone and whispered, "I'm trying, Grandma. I really am." The cemetery was empty except for the sound of wind and distant cars. I remember thinking that if ghosts could talk, hers would probably tell me to stop doubting myself. She never believed in self-pity. She believed in work. As the years passed, I saved every spare dollar I earned. I didn't go on vacations or buy new clothes. Every decision I made was about the future I wanted to build when I finally turned 25 and could access that trust. My friends thought I was overly cautious. "It's just money," one of them said. "You could always get a loan." But for me, it wasn't about the money. It was about legacy, hers and mine. It was about proving that her belief in me wasn't misplaced. Sometimes I'd visit her old workshop, now locked and collecting dust. I'd peek through the small side window and imagine her sitting there, her hair pulled back, her hands steady over some circuit board. The house had been sold to strangers, but I couldn't help thinking that the space still hummed with her energy. I wondered if they ever felt it, the ghost of a woman who believed in quiet brilliance. A few months before my 25th birthday, my father brought up the trust again over dinner. "You know," he said casually, "your grandmother would want you to use that money wisely. Maybe invest in something solid. Adam's thinking about business school in Seattle. We could, well, we'll see." I smiled, polite as always, and said nothing. But inside, something twisted. It was the first time I sensed that the trust wasn't really mine in their eyes. It was a resource to be directed, a tool to support what they valued. I told myself I was being paranoid. Parents want what's best, right? Still, the unease lingered. On the night before my 25th birthday, I stayed up late working on a repair job. An old record player someone had brought in. When it finally crackled to life, I closed my eyes and smiled. Tomorrow, I thought, everything changes. Tomorrow, I get to start my real life. I didn't know that the same trust I'd cherished for 4 years had already been quietly rewritten. I didn't know that while I was working late, my future had been signed away in neat legal ink. If there's one thing I've learned since, it's that betrayal doesn't always announce itself with slammed doors or shouting matches. Sometimes it hides inside good intentions, inside polite smiles, inside the people who say they love you most. And as I drifted to sleep that night, I had no idea that my grandmother's final gift, the symbol of everything she believed in me for, was already in someone else's hands. The morning of my 25th birthday felt almost ceremonial. The air in Seattle carried that faint chill that makes everything sharper, cleaner. I had saved up for a bus ticket from Austin to Seattle to meet the lawyer who handled my grandmother's trust. I could have waited for the documents to be mailed, but I wanted to be there in person, to feel it, to hold something real that belonged only to me. I remember the outfit I wore. A navy blazer I'd found at a thrift store for $12, a white button-up shirt still stiff from its first wash, and black jeans that had seen better days. I even straightened my hair, something I rarely bothered with. It wasn't vanity. It was a quiet promise to myself that this would be the day everything changed. The law office was on the 20th floor of a glass building downtown, sleek and sterile. the kind of place where even the air smelled expensive. I arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the lobby, hands folded over my lap, trying to ignore the nerves clawing at my chest. The receptionist smiled politely, but I could tell she'd seen 100 people like me, hopeful, nervous, about to learn something they didn't expect. When the lawyer finally appeared, he looked exactly like the kind of man who'd been doing this for too long. Gray suit, half-moon glasses, expression somewhere between sympathy and exhaustion. "Miss Whitmore," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Charles Avery. Please come in." His office overlooked the bay. I could see a ferry cutting through the water, slow and deliberate. It felt poetic somehow, something moving forward while I sat waiting for my turn. He started with the formalities, flipping through a folder so thick it could have been mistaken for a novel. "Your grandmother set up a modest trust fund, as you know," he began. "It was to remain inactive until your 25th birthday. You are now eligible for activation and transfer of assets." For a moment, I thought I might cry from relief. 4 years of saving, waiting, dreaming, all leading to this moment. I pictured the small tech studio I wanted to start, the workshops for young girls, the way I'd finally build something of my own. But then he paused. Lawyers never pause for no reason. "There's been a change," he said carefully. "Roughly 9 months ago." My heart stuttered. "A change?" He adjusted his glasses, avoiding my eyes. "Your parents, as controlling guardians of the trust until your 25th birthday, reassigned the beneficiary rights." "Reassigned?" The word tasted foreign. "To who?" He hesitated just long enough to make the room tilt. "To your brother, Adam Whitmore." The air seemed to thicken. I blinked, once, twice, waiting for him to correct himself. "That doesn't make sense," I said quietly. "The trust was in my name. My grandmother." "Yes," he interrupted softly. "She was very clear about her wishes. However, your father had legal authority as managing guardian until your birthday. Within that window, he executed a reassignment. It's completely within his rights under state law." My mouth went dry. The words blurred. I heard the lawyer say something about paperwork, notarization, state statutes, but it all sounded distant, like I was underwater. I forced myself to speak. "So what you're saying is, when my grandmother left something specifically for me, my father signed it over to my brother before I could touch it." He nodded once, the kind of nod that comes with practiced sympathy. "Yes?" I wanted to laugh. Not the kind that means you're amused, the kind that bursts out because it's the only sound big enough to fill the silence after your world tilts. He reached into the folder and slid a handwritten note across the desk. "Your father left this. He said you should read it." The note was written in his familiar looping scrawl, the same handwriting that used to appear on my report cards when he signed them with disappointment. One sentence, that was all. Open quote, "Adam knows how to turn opportunity into success. Lena still needs guidance." Close quote. I read it once, twice. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I'd spent too many years building calluses where feelings should have been. "Is there anything left?" I asked finally. My voice was calm, almost detached. He hesitated again, then flipped through the folder. "There's a brokerage account still under your name, roughly $80,000 in investment shares. They haven't been retitled yet. Legally, they'll transfer once the paperwork is processed, but..." "How long does that take?" "Usually a few weeks," he said. "Sometimes longer." "Then until they do," I said, rising from the chair, "they're still mine." He looked startled. "Technically, yes, but you should understand that once the reassignment..." "I understand perfectly." I gathered the papers into a neat pile and slid them into my bag. My hands weren't shaking. They should have been, but they weren't. When I left the building, the rain had started. Seattle rain isn't dramatic. It's a quiet mist, like the sky sighing. I stood under the awning for a moment, letting the cool air hit my face. People rushed past me, clutching umbrellas, hurrying towards somewhere that mattered. I didn't move. I just stood there and realized, maybe for the first time in my life, that no one was coming to save me. I walked for hours that day, through the gray streets and over the slick sidewalks until my legs ached. Every few blocks, I'd take out the note and read it again. Lena still needs guidance. It was such a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of every dismissal, every quiet insult disguised as concern, every time they'd told me I wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't enough. By the time I reached the bus station, I wasn't angry anymore. just clear. Crystal clear. That night, in the cheap motel where I stayed before heading back to Portland, I sat at the small desk with my laptop and opened the brokerage portal. I knew exactly what I was doing. I'd read enough of my grandmother's documents to understand the boundaries of the trust. The shares were still legally tied to my name until the reassignment completed. My cursor hovered over the sell button for a long time. Then, with a single breath, I clicked it. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. $80,000 of quiet defiance. When the confirmation email arrived, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, exactly, but relief. Like I had just taken back a piece of myself that had been buried under years of doubt. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my parents, not Adam. The next morning, I wired the funds into a new account and began sketching plans for the repair shop I'd dreamed about for years. It didn't feel like theft. It felt like breathing after being underwater too long. On the bus ride home, I looked out the window as the highway blurred past. Somewhere between the raindrops and the endless road, I whispered a quiet promise to my grandmother. They took what you left me, but I'm still going to build it. The bus rattled, the world moved on, and I realized something else. Betrayal doesn't just reveal who people are, it reveals who you are. And sitting there, broke but finally awake, I knew exactly who I was. When I returned to Portland after that meeting in Seattle, the city felt different. The air was colder, heavier, and even the sound of traffic seemed distant, like I was moving through a world made of glass. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. It was as if the betrayal had changed the shape of the air I breathed. My parents had done what I'd feared they were always capable of, turning my future into my brother's safety net. But instead of falling apart, I felt something new. A strange calm. A kind of quiet clarity that only comes after you've been burned and realize the fire can't kill you. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, bare walls, flickering lamp, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I spread out the paperwork from the trust on the kitchen table. The documents were crisp, heavy, official. My father's signature sat there like a brand, cold and confident. But so did my name, on that one surviving account still under my control. $80,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was mine. And I decided right then that I wasn't going to let them take another inch from me. For years, my parents had told me I wasn't ready, that I wasn't practical, that my ideas were just hobbies. They built a world where my confidence had to ask permission to exist. And that night, I stopped asking. The next morning, I opened a new account at a local credit union, one not linked to anything in my parents' names, and transferred every cent from the brokerage into it. Then, I walked into the county registrar's office and filled out the paperwork for a business license. Circuit Haven. The name came to me like a whisper from my grandmother's old workshop, a place where broken things could be rebuilt, where the quiet could finally hum with purpose. I rented a narrow, rundown garage on the east side of town. The concrete floor was cracked, the walls smelled faintly of mildew, and the only furniture was an old workbench left behind by the previous tenant. It was perfect. It reminded me of Grandma June's shop, the way she'd always said that beauty doesn't start with perfection. It starts with persistence. Those first few weeks were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. I scrubbed floors, patched leaks, and painted the walls a soft gray blue because it felt like calm after chaos. I bought secondhand shelves from Craigslist, labeled plastic bins with masking tape, and ordered a neon sign online that simply read "Open." There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no applause, no one standing beside me. Just the hum of the soldering iron and the smell of coffee at midnight. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone to tell me I was doing the right thing. I knew. I started small, fixing phones, laptops, and old radios. My first customer was a single mother whose son had spilled juice on her work computer. When I handed it back 2 days later, fully functional, she hugged me. That simple gratitude meant more to me than every compliment I'd ever received from my family combined. I decided that Circuit Haven wouldn't just be a repair shop. It would be a space where people felt seen, where broken didn't mean useless. Every device I repaired felt like a small act of rebellion, one quiet restoration against a lifetime of being told some things weren't worth fixing. A few weeks in, I hung a wooden sign over the door with a quote my grandmother used to say, "Fix what others discard, including yourself." It wasn't just for customers, it was for me. Every day I looked at it and reminded myself that even after being discarded, I could rebuild. But rebuilding wasn't simple. My savings dwindled quickly. I learned that rent doesn't wait for dreams to mature. Some nights, I slept on a cot in the back room because I couldn't afford to keep my apartment. There were moments I questioned everything, whether I'd made a terrible mistake, whether the money would run out before the customers came. But every time doubt crept in, I thought of my father's note. Lena still needs guidance. It fueled me like oxygen in a vacuum. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old circuit boards, I found the small brass keychain Grandma June used to keep on her workbench. It was shaped like a lightning bolt. She once told me it symbolized energy, the spark that keeps you moving when logic says stop. I hung it above my workstation like a charm. As the weeks turned to months, small miracles began to happen. People started returning, not just because I fixed things cheaply, but because I listened. I'd hear stories: a widow bringing in her late husband's radio, a teenage boy saving up to repair his gaming console, an old man trying to restore a record player from the 1960s. Each repair felt personal, like I was stitching tiny pieces of the world back together. I began offering weekend classes for local kids who wanted to learn how to build simple gadgets: solar lights, mini speakers, battery packs. I called it the Tinker Lab, and it became my favorite part of the week. Watching their faces light up when their projects worked reminded me of my younger self, sitting in Grandma June's garage, believing that creation was a kind of magic. Word spread slowly but surely. The shop never had more than 3 customers at a time, but there was always someone coming through the door, carrying something broken and hopeful. My bank account wasn't impressive, but my days were full of meaning. One evening, after closing up, I sat on the floor with a cup of tea, surrounded by half-repaired laptops and old tools. The city outside buzzed faintly, distant and unbothered. I thought about my parents, how they must have congratulated Adam for his new inheritance, probably telling themselves it was for the best. And instead of anger, I felt a strange peace, because for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need to prove them wrong. I just needed to keep going. I opened my notebook and wrote 3 words across the top of a blank page. This is freedom. That night, as rain tapped softly on the roof, I made one final decision. I'd never tell them what I'd done. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing I had used the same money they stole to build something real. Let them think I'd stayed small, unremarkable, the quiet one. Because one day, when Circuit Haven's sign glowed bright enough, they'd see. And maybe they'd finally understand what my grandmother had always known, that silence isn't weakness, it's focus. So I kept building. I repaired another laptop, another phone, another small piece of hope. And in the hum of my workshop, I could almost hear her voice again, steady and warm. See, Lena? Some people talk about changing the world. You just pick up a screwdriver and start. That was my rebellion. Not loud, not vengeful, just steady, deliberate, and my own. The message came on a Tuesday morning. The shop was quiet, the faint buzz of the soldering iron filling the air, and the rain outside was tapping against the windows like it wanted to be let in. My phone lit up with a text from my mother. "Hey, sweetie, Adam mentioned something about a letter from the bank. Did you touch the account?" It was written in her usual soft tone, polite but sharp underneath, the kind of tone that makes you feel like you've done something wrong even when you haven't. I stared at the message for a full minute before responding. I typed, "Everything's fine. You might want to ask Dad," and added a smiley face I didn't mean. She heart-reacted it within seconds. The kind of empty digital affection that said, "Let's pretend this isn't a problem." A few hours later, my father called. No greeting, no small talk. "Lena," he said, his voice low, clipped, controlled, "you touched the account." It wasn't a question. I could almost see him pacing his office back in Austin, probably gripping his phone with that righteous tension he reserved for teachable moments. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to get uncomfortable. "I managed what was still under my name," I finally said. "That money wasn't just for you," he snapped. "It was meant for Adam's education. His MBA program in Seattle. You've compromised a lot more than you realize. Education? I said slowly. He's 30, Dad, and that MBA program, is that the same one that cost 60 grand for a certificate in leadership? He hesitated, then pressed on, louder now. You don't understand the bigger picture. We had investments tied to that trust. You've created a financial mess that affects all of us. That phrase, all of us, hit a nerve. It was always us when it benefited them, and you when it didn't. You mean it affects Adam, I said quietly. There was a pause on the other end. I could almost hear him recalibrating, realizing anger wasn't working. When he spoke again, his voice had softened, practiced. We just want what's best for you, Lena. You've made an impulsive choice, and I'm worried you'll regret it. There it was, the Whitmore family's favorite weapon, concern. They never yelled when guilt could do the job. I'm fine, I said simply. Lena, please. I'm fine, I repeated, slower this time. You made your choices, I made mine. When I hung up, my hands were trembling, but it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. The kind you get after years of being talked over and finally realizing you can hang up the phone whenever you want. Over the next week, the silence from my family was deafening. Then came the group chat. It was called Family Circle, a relic from years ago when Mom insisted we needed better communication. The chat had been dead for months. Suddenly, it came alive again. Mom, I think we should all talk, like adults. Seriously, Lena, why are you being so dramatic? Just explain what happened. Mom again, your grandmother wouldn't want tension between you two. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. We can fix this if you're willing to be reasonable. I stared at the screen, every message a familiar loop of deflection and guilt. Adam playing the victim, Mom performing peacekeeper, Dad asserting control disguised as rationality. For the first time, I didn't reply. I simply left the group. That night, I sat alone in my shop. The lights were dim, the neon sign outside casting a soft glow across the walls. I should have felt lonely, but instead there was a strange comfort in the quiet. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn their approval, thinking it would bring peace. But peace wasn't in their acceptance, it was in their absence. 3 days later, I received a certified letter in the mail. Thick envelope. Government stamps. For a second, I thought it might be legal trouble. Instead, it was an informal mediation request, signed by my father. It claimed that my unauthorized liquidation of assets had disrupted family financial planning and suggested we settle this privately. Attached was a proposal. If I agreed to return a portion of the funds, they would offer me a $20,000 goodwill payment. To smooth things over. I laughed. Loud, involuntary laughter that echoed through the empty shop. $20,000 to make me forget the betrayal of a lifetime. I taped the letter above my workbench next to an old blueprint of a circuit I'd built with Grandma June when I was a teenager. It stayed there as a reminder that dignity is not negotiable. The following week, my father showed up in person. I didn't even know he was in Oregon until he walked through the glass door of Circuit Haven, the bell jingling softly like a warning. He was still the same. Pressed shirt, expensive watch, the faint smell of aftershave that used to fill our house. Lena, he said with a nod, as if we were colleagues meeting for coffee instead of a father confronting his daughter about taking back her own money. Dad, I replied, setting down my tools. To what do I owe the pleasure? He glanced around the shop, eyes scanning the worn floor and cluttered shelves. This is nice, he said, his tone caught somewhere between surprise and judgment. You've certainly been busy. I have, I said. What brings you here? He exhaled sharply, like the conversation was already exhausting him. Do you even understand what you've done? I think so, I said, wiping my hands on a towel. I funded my business with the money my grandmother left me, the money you decided wasn't mine. He stepped closer. That trust wasn't just about you, Lena. It was part of a family plan, a legacy fund. We all contributed to that structure. You had no right to dismantle it. I looked him straight in the eyes. You mean I had no right to stop you from using me as collateral? His jaw tightened. That's not fair. Neither was what you did. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, softer. You're being emotional. I know you feel wronged, but this isn't how family operates. We support each other. Support? I repeated. You didn't support me, Dad. You just expected me to stay small enough to fit inside your plans. He looked at me then, the way people look at strangers they almost recognize. You'll regret this one day, he said, low and certain. Maybe, I said, but at least they'll be my regrets, not yours. He left without another word. The sound of the door closing was final, sharp, and for a long time afterward, I just stood there staring at the empty doorway. Later that night, I got another text, from Adam this time. He's really upset, Lena. This could have been handled better. You've made things harder for everyone. I typed a reply and erased it 3 times before finally sending just 2 words. Not mine. No punctuation, no apology, just truth. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. The kind of sleep that feels like a confession finally released. In the weeks that followed, the family silence became permanent. No calls, no messages, no more guilt-laced peace offerings. And in that silence, something inside me began to heal. I realized how much of my life had been lived in reaction to them, defending, explaining, shrinking. Without them in the picture, there was finally room for something else, growth. I poured myself into Circuit Haven, into the work, into the satisfaction of fixing what was broken. Every soldered wire, every repaired circuit felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they'd tried to rewrite. Betrayal had built the walls, but I was the one who filled them with light. And as I watched the shop glow softly in the evening haze, I thought of Grandma June. I imagined her smiling that small, knowing smile. She'd always said the quiet ones don't fight to be heard. They build something that speaks for them. And I was finally learning how to let my work do the talking. There's a quiet kind of courage that comes when you have nothing left to lose. After the storm with my family, the silence that followed didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like space. For the first time in my life, I had room to breathe, to think, to create without worrying about who was watching or judging. Circuit Haven became more than a business. It became the pulse of my new life, the heartbeat that replaced the one that had been broken. The shop didn't look like much from the outside. It sat wedged between an old laundromat and a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar. The sign I'd painted myself was crooked, the paint slightly uneven, but when the light hit it just right, the words Circuit Haven glowed like something hopeful. Inside, the space was a mosaic of imperfection. Mismatched stools, repurposed shelves, a secondhand coffee maker that sputtered every morning, and a radio that played jazz from a local station I couldn't quite tune in properly. It was messy, human, real, everything my family had never been. The first few months were brutal. Some weeks I didn't make enough to cover rent, so I'd skip meals or stretch cans of soup for days. I learned to live on little and to celebrate small victories, like when a customer came back or when I repaired something I wasn't sure I could. One afternoon, an older man brought in a dusty cassette player that had belonged to his late wife. "It hasn't played since she passed," he said quietly. I spent hours taking it apart, cleaning it, rewiring the connections. When I finally hit play and the music filled the room, he cried. Not the loud, broken kind of crying, but the quiet, grateful kind that changes something in you. That moment taught me something essential. Sometimes fixing things isn't about profit. It's about giving people a piece of their life back. Word of mouth began to spread. People liked that I didn't overcharge or talk down to them. They liked that I explained what was broken and showed them how to avoid it happening again. I started keeping a jar on the counter labeled "Pay What You Can Repairs" for customers who couldn't afford the full price. Some days it was empty, some days it overflowed. I never counted it. What mattered was that people came. A few months in, a woman from a local news outlet stopped by. She'd heard about the shop through a teacher whose classroom projector I had fixed for free. "I'm writing a feature about small businesses run by women in tech," she said. "Would you mind sharing your story?" I wanted to say no. The idea of being seen still made me uneasy, but something in her tone, genuine curiosity, not pity, made me agree. We talked for an hour. I told her about the shop, the community classes I had started on weekends for teens interested in electronics, and the importance of giving people a space to learn without judgment. I didn't mention my family, or the trust fund, or the betrayal. I talked only about what I was building. 2 weeks later, the article came out in the Portland Tribune. "Woman rebuilds her future, one circuit at a time." It was short, but the response was overwhelming. People started showing up at the shop with repairs, donations, and even offers to help. A retired electrician volunteered to teach at my weekend workshops. A local coffee shop brought free pastries for the students every Saturday morning. It felt like the city itself had reached out a hand and pulled me out of the shadows. But success, even quiet success, has a way of echoing. One evening, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I stared at her name for a long time before answering. Her voice was soft, careful. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "I saw the article. Your father and I are proud of you. Maybe we could come by sometime, take a photo for Facebook. You know, show everyone how well you're doing." It was like deja vu. Her tone so sweet it almost disguised the manipulation underneath. I took a slow breath. "You can't pose for a story you didn't believe in," I said gently. There was silence on the other end, followed by a small sigh. "You've always been dramatic, Lena," she said, just before hanging up. After that call, I didn't feel angry, just free. The need for their approval had finally burned out, like a candle at the end of its wick. I realized then that validation had been my family's favorite currency, and for the first time, I'd stopped trading in it. Around that time, I hired my first part-time assistant, a college student named Luca, who loved tinkering with old tech as much as I did. He was shy but brilliant, always asking questions, always eager to learn. We spent long evenings repairing vintage equipment, drinking bad coffee, and sharing stories about life, ambition, and the fear of disappointing the people who raised us. I saw a bit of myself in him, someone trying to prove he belonged in a world that didn't expect much from him. As Circuit Haven grew, I started noticing something else. People came not just for repairs, but for connection. A single mother would bring her daughter just to watch, saying it inspired her to see women working with tools. Veterans dropped by to chat about their old radios or fix Army-grade equipment from decades ago. Sometimes they just needed to talk. The shop became a small sanctuary for anyone who felt unseen, a space built from my pain but sustained by their stories. One afternoon, a high school counselor visited and asked if I'd consider mentoring a few students. They were kids from difficult backgrounds, bright but lost. I agreed instantly. The next week, 3 teenagers showed up. 2 girls and a boy, all nervous, all pretending they didn't care. I taught them how to repair small appliances, solder safely, and diagnose issues. But what I really wanted to teach them was patience. The same patience that had kept me alive when everything else fell apart. Watching them work reminded me of my grandmother. I could almost hear her voice in the room, calm and wise, saying, "People think strength is loud, but it's just quiet persistence." I decided to hang one of her old quotes above the classroom area, "Build what you wish existed." Months passed, and the shop's walls slowly filled with photos, thank you notes, and drawings from kids who'd built their first gadget. Every piece of paper was proof that healing could multiply when shared. I didn't have wealth or prestige, but I had something far more valuable: purpose. One rainy evening, as I locked up, I noticed a woman standing outside under an umbrella, reading the article I'd framed near the door. She smiled when she saw me. "You fixed my daughter's laptop," she said. "She's in college now, studying computer engineering." Her voice trembled with pride. "You gave her confidence." After she left, I sat in the dark shop, surrounded by humming machines and faint light from the street outside. It struck me then that my grandmother's trust fund had worked exactly as she intended. It didn't buy me comfort, it bought me courage. I still thought about my family sometimes, but the bitterness had faded. In its place was a quiet gratitude. Their betrayal had forced me to build a life from nothing, and that life had turned out more honest, more mine, than anything they could have planned for me. Grace, I realized, isn't something you wait for. It's something you build, piece by piece, out of the ashes of what was meant to break you. And as I sat there, listening to the soft hum of a repaired radio playing an old jazz tune, I finally understood what my grandmother meant all those years ago. Some people talk about second chances, but the brave ones make them. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the rhythm of work lulled me into a steady calm. The rain outside was light, tapping softly against the windows of Circuit Haven, and I was bent over a disassembled tablet, lost in the familiar hum of solder and static. The shop smelled faintly of metal and coffee. Luca was in the back sorting cables, humming under his breath. Nothing about that day felt different, until the bell above the door rang and a voice I hadn't heard in years said my name. Lena. I froze. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I looked up, and there he was, Adam. Time had not been kind to him. His usual glow of confidence was gone, replaced by exhaustion that clung to him like smoke. His once perfect hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and the sharp gleam in his eyes had dimmed into something I couldn't quite name. He looked smaller somehow, like the space he used to command had collapsed in on itself. "Hey," he said, attempting a weak smile. "This place looks nice." I set the soldering iron down carefully. "What are you doing here?" He took a hesitant step forward, his hands shoved into his pockets like a boy caught doing something wrong. "I was in town. Thought I'd stop by." "Really?" I asked, arching a brow. "You were in Portland randomly and decided to drop in?" He laughed softly, but it wasn't the easy, charming laugh I remembered from our childhood. It was thin, brittle. "All right, that's not the whole truth," he admitted. "I came because I need to talk to you." I gestured toward the counter. "You're talking." He hesitated before sitting down on the stool across from me, looking around the shop. His gaze lingered on the sign that hung on the far wall, "Fix what others discard, including yourself." He smiled faintly. "You really made this work," he said. "I didn't think you could." I finished for him. He met my eyes and had the decency to look ashamed. "I didn't mean it like that." I leaned back against the counter. "How did you mean it, then?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know. I guess I didn't realize how hard this must have been for you, for what Dad and I did." His voice cracked slightly at the end, and I almost didn't recognize it. Adam had always been smooth, practiced, the kind of man who could talk his way out of any mistake. But now, his words stumbled. "What do you want, Adam?" I asked quietly. He swallowed. "A job." The silence between us thickened. I thought I'd misheard him. "You're joking." He shook his head. "I wish I were. Everything's gone, Lena. The podcast failed, the sponsors pulled out, and the company I was working with folded. I spent the last of my savings trying to launch that wellness brand you warned me about." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out, positive thinking doesn't pay bills." I stared at him, trying to read whether this was another performance, but there was something raw in his eyes, an unfamiliar humility. "So you came to me," I said, "to the sister whose trust fund you inherited, the one who wasn't smart enough to handle it." He nodded. "I know how it sounds, but I'm not asking for a handout. Just work. I'll sweep floors, run errands, whatever you need." Part of me wanted to throw him out, to remind him of every cruel thing he'd said, every time he'd stood beside our father while I was dismissed and diminished. But another part of me, the part that had built this shop on the idea that broken things deserve second chances, hesitated. I exhaled slowly. "I don't need an assistant," I said. His shoulders slumped, and he nodded as if he'd expected that. "But," I continued, "I do need someone to manage inventory and vendor calls. It's not glamorous. Minimum wage, no special treatment." He looked up, eyes wide. "You're serious?" "Yes," I said, "but this isn't charity. You show up on time, you do the work, and you don't talk to me like we're back in that house. Understood?" A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. "Understood." That first week, he showed up late twice and broke one of my soldering pens. I nearly fired him. But then something shifted. He started arriving early, cleaning the workspace without being asked, even fixing the broken espresso machine that had been collecting dust in the corner. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was usually to ask questions about repairs or business logistics. The arrogance that used to fill every room he entered was gone. In its place was quiet effort. Luca, my assistant, didn't trust him at first. "You sure this is a good idea?" he whispered one afternoon. "He's your brother." "That's complicated." "Everything about family is complicated," I said. "But sometimes people need to build before they can atone." Weeks passed, and I found myself watching Adam with a mix of disbelief and reluctant pride. He learned fast, asked for feedback, and when he made mistakes, he owned them. He even fixed a few of his own, both mechanical and emotional. One evening, as we were closing, he lingered by the counter. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think being successful meant being seen, that if people weren't clapping for you, it didn't count. But you built all this quietly. No spotlight, no noise, just Real. I didn't respond, but his words stayed with me long after he left that night. One day, a customer came in with an old radio that had belonged to her father, who'd been a veteran. It was rusted and half dead. Adam volunteered to handle the repair. I watched him work for hours, steady, careful, patient. When he finally turned it on and the static gave way to music, the woman cried. Adam looked up at me, his eyes wet too, and whispered, "Now I get it." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. Our parents found out soon after. Mom texted me first. "Adam says you hired him." "That's wonderful, sweetie. Maybe we can all have dinner soon? Take a photo for the holidays?" I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then I typed, "You didn't celebrate me when I had nothing. Don't pose with me now that I've built something." She left it on read. Adam never mentioned the message, but the next morning, he came in 10 minutes early with coffee for both of us. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. It was his way of acknowledging that he knew exactly where we stood, and that for once, he was willing to earn his place instead of being handed it. Over time, the tension between us softened into something fragile but real. He didn't apologize directly for what happened with the trust, but he didn't need to. His actions were apology enough. He worked hard, stayed humble, and in that small shop that had once been mine alone, we began to rebuild. Not as siblings defined by a family legacy, but as two people trying to unlearn it. Sometimes, when we locked up for the night, I'd watch him stand by the neon sign, his reflection glowing faintly against the window. I'd think about how strange it was that the brother who once took everything from me had become a part of the life I built after losing it all. I didn't trust him completely. Not yet. But trust, like any good repair, takes time. And as the days stretched into weeks and the hum of the shop grew louder with work and laughter, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, some things could be fixed after all. The morning the article went live, I didn't even know. Luca was the one who told me. He came rushing into the shop, waving his phone like it was on fire. "Lena, you're on the front page," he said, breathless with excitement. "Not local this time. Statewide." I laughed, thinking he was exaggerating. But then I saw it. My name printed across the top of the Oregon Business Journal, from garage tinkerer to community innovator, the quiet rebuild of Lena Whitmore. I didn't feel triumphant or even proud at first. Just still. Like life had gone full circle in the quietest way possible. I had spent so many years invisible, unheard, and now people wanted to know how I'd done it. The irony was almost too perfect. The piece wasn't flashy. It didn't talk about betrayal or family drama. It focused on the shop, on the mentorship programs, the recycled materials, the community projects we'd started. There was even a photo of me at my workbench, smiling faintly, and behind me, blurred but visible, was Adam, holding a box of wires, mid-motion. He didn't know he'd been in the shot, but I kept it that way. It felt symbolic somehow. He was part of the story, even if not in focus. By noon, my inbox was full. Former customers congratulated me. A local radio station wanted an interview. Even people from high school, people who had once called me strange or shy, wrote messages like, "Always knew you'd make it." The truth, of course, was that they hadn't known at all. But I smiled anyway. There was no satisfaction in bitterness anymore. Then came the message I'd been expecting. My father. He didn't call this time. He emailed as if professionalism could hide guilt. "We're proud of you, Lena," he wrote. "It's wonderful to see your hard work paying off. Maybe we could collaborate, feature your success as part of the family's community outreach initiative. It would be a great look for the company." The company. That was the word that caught me. My father's landscaping business had rebranded after expanding into eco-friendly projects. I'd looked it up once out of curiosity. The website had a polished banner that read Whitmore and Sons, a family legacy. There were smiling faces on the homepage, including an old photo from years ago. It was the four of us, Dad, Mom, Adam, and me, standing in front of our childhood home. I hadn't realized they'd used it until now. That image had always haunted me. It was taken the summer after Grandma June's funeral. I was 17, holding a screwdriver in one hand, my hair frizzed from the heat. I remember not wanting to be in that photo. Now, it was being used to sell a legacy that had nearly erased me. I replied with a single line, "I do not consent to the use of my image for commercial purposes. Please remove it within 48 hours. No greeting, no closing, just business. Within a day, the website was under maintenance. Another silence followed, but this time it wasn't painful. It was satisfying. Not the vindictive kind of satisfaction, but the quiet sort that feels like closure. I didn't need them to apologize. The truth had already rewritten itself in the form of work, community, and growth that no one could take credit for but me. A week later, I took a rare day off and drove south to the edge of Austin, Texas. I hadn't been back in years, but I wanted to see Grandma June's old house one more time before it disappeared into memory. The siding was faded now, the porch swing gone, the garden overgrown. But as I stepped out of the truck, I could still smell the faint scent of solder and rain, the ghost of our old projects hanging in the air. The new owners had repainted the garage door, but the outline of where the old workbench used to stand was still visible against the wall. I stood there for a long time, tracing the memory of her voice in my head. Some people talk their way into a room. You'll build your own. And I had. Before leaving, I pulled out my phone and opened an email from months ago, one from Mr. Avery, the lawyer who had handled her trust. Attached was a scanned note they'd found tucked between the original documents. It wasn't legally binding, he told me, but personal. A handwritten message in her neat looping script. If Lena still fixes what's broken with steady hands, she's the one I was always betting on. I reread it 3 times, letting the words sink in until my throat tightened. She had seen me clearly, long before anyone else had even tried to. I whispered a quiet thank you into the wind and turned back toward the truck. When I returned to Portland, Adam was already at the shop, early as usual. He'd organized the storage shelves and was labeling cables in alphabetical order. He looked up when I came in. "You're back," he said. "I am." He smiled just a little. "We got another order from the community center. They want a full batch of refurbished laptops." "Good," I said. "Let's make it happen." He nodded and went back to work. There was no need to talk about the past anymore. Some relationships don't need grand reconciliations. They just need time, consistency, and silence that doesn't hurt anymore. Ours was one of those. That afternoon, a teenager named Julian walked in with his mother. He'd heard about our workshops from a teacher at his school. His backpack was stuffed with wires, broken circuit boards, and the kind of cautious hope I recognized instantly. "Are you the one who fixes things?" he asked. I smiled. "That's me. What do you want to learn?" "Everything," he said. I handed him a pair of gloves. "Then let's start with this. If you break something, you fix it." He grinned, the kind of grin that made me see a younger version of myself, hopeful, hungry to create, still believing the world was repairable. Adam passed him a screwdriver, and for a moment, the 3 of us stood there, teacher, helper, and student, surrounded by the hum of soldering irons and quiet possibility. As the day faded, I sat by the window, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The shop glowed softly, alive with sound and purpose. This small place, built from the ashes of what I'd lost, had become more than a repair shop. It was a refuge, a bridge between the past and everything still waiting ahead. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one sitting alone in a dark apartment, staring at legal papers that spelled out betrayal. She wouldn't have believed that peace could look like this. She wouldn't have believed she could survive what she did, let alone thrive after it. But I had. And not through revenge or anger, but through quiet persistence, the kind my grandmother had taught me, the kind that outlasts everything. Before locking up for the night, I turned off the neon sign and looked around the room one last time. Tools neatly arranged, soldering smoke lingering in the air, the faint sound of Adam and Julian laughing in the back room. I whispered softly to no one in particular, "I built my own room." And in that moment, I understood something my family never did. Success isn't always loud. It doesn't need applause or recognition. Sometimes success is just the steady hum of a life you built with your own hands. The quiet proof that you never needed permission to begin. In the end, Lena Whitmore's story wasn't about revenge, wealth, or proving her family wrong. It was about reclaiming ownership of her life, piece by piece, wire by wire, one quiet victory at a time. She began as the overlooked daughter, dismissed and underestimated, trapped in the shadow of her brother's golden reputation. Yet, when her parents betrayed her trust, literally and figuratively, Lena chose not to destroy them, but to rebuild herself. With nothing but determination and the lessons her grandmother left behind, she turned loss into purpose. What started as a small repair shop became a sanctuary for others who were also trying to rebuild what was broken. Even when her brother returned, stripped of his pride, she met him not with resentment, but with the same quiet strength that had saved her. Her story reminds us that success doesn't always roar. It often hums softly, built through patience, discipline, and grace. The world celebrates the loud achievers, but sometimes the truest victories are silent, surviving, rebuilding, forgiving, and moving forward without bitterness. Lena's journey teaches us that betrayal can either harden you or refine you, and that choosing to rise with integrity creates a strength no one can take away. The lesson? You don't need permission to start again. You don't need applause to matter. The life you build quietly, with resilience and purpose, will always speak louder than the voices that once doubted you. So when life breaks something inside you, don't wait for someone else to fix it. Pick up your own tools, steady your hands, and start rebuilding. Question for you. If you were in Lena's place, what would you do? A. Cut ties completely and never look back. B. Choose forgiveness and build your own peace. Comment your answer below, A or B. I'd love to know how you would handle it. And tell me, what's your takeaway from Lena's story? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and support the channel. Your encouragement helps us create more inspiring stories like this one.